Good evening. The Virginia Public Access Project and the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University welcome you to After Virginia Votes. Tonight, a retrospective on the 2022 Virginia midterm elections. This live broadcast is presented by Walmart and made possible by our sponsors: Innova, Carillion Clinic, Cox Communications, Mercer Trigiani, Northern Virginia Electric Cooperative, Centera, Town Bank, Jean Marie and Tom Davis, Joan Huffer and Rob Duggar, James W. Hazel, Nancy and Edward Rice, and viewers like you. Now, please welcome your host and moderator for this evening, NBC4 Northern Virginia Bureau Chief, Julie Carey.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to After Virginia Votes. My name is Julie Carey. I'm the Northern Virginia Bureau Chief for NBC4, and it is my great privilege to once again moderate this unique event organized by the nonpartisan Virginia Public Access Project. The purpose of Virginia Votes is to gain a deeper understanding of this year's midterm elections and to consider what the results say about Virginia's direction at a time of deep national division. We'll be focusing on the three most competitive congressional districts, the 2nd in Hampton Roads and the 7th and the 10th, both anchored in Northern Virginia. I'll be joined by two seasoned political professionals who've agreed to leave their partisan talking points at the door and to engage in a candid conversation about the midterms. And then our second part of the show, I'll be joined by two respected political commentators who will consider what this year's results mean for Virginia going forward. Now, in our first segment, we will be saving time for a few questions that have been sent in from the live stream audience and from the small audience in this room. You can also weigh in on the conversation on Twitter by using the hashtag AfterVAVotes. But before we get started, let's take a look at a handful of data visualizations prepared by VPAP. They'll give us a common understanding of what happened in Virginia last Tuesday. So let's begin with money in politics, specifically the independent expenditures that have become the driving force in modern congressional elections. This is where the, quote, smart money, the national political parties and single interest groups, focus on seats they believe they can flip or hold. Now, the 7th District contest between two-term Democratic Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger and Republican challenger Yesli Vega, that attracted the most money, $24 million. The 2nd District race saw $12 million, perhaps reflecting the lower TV ad rates in the Hampton Roads market. But the smart money on both sides saw nothing in their internal polls to indicate that the 10th District was seriously in play. In fact, a quarter of the spending in the 10th came from Governor Youngkin's new federal super PAC. Our next slide will explore redistricting. You can see that Terry McAuliffe carried only one of the three targeted districts in the 2021 gubernatorial election. So how did redistricting change the calculus? According to VPAP estimates, the 10th became slightly more friendly to Republicans, as did the 2nd. But the 7th moved several points to the left. But Youngkin still would have carried the reconfigured 7th. Now, while on paper redistricting gave Abigail Spanberger a more favorable district, it came at a cost. Moving the 7th's population base from the Richmond suburbs to the D.C. suburbs meant that much of the goodwill and name recognition she had built up over the last 4 years disappeared in an instant. She faced the daunting task of introducing herself to 3/4 of her district's new voters, or her new district's voters, rather. Now, our last series of slides takes a look at how the results last Tuesday stacked up against pre-election statements at those rallies headlined by Governor Youngkin. He predicted that his 2021 victory was the start of a building and growing red wave. But it turns out all three Republican candidates underperformed Youngkin's benchmark at the city and county level. The first slide shows that Yesli Vega underperformed by 5 to 6 percentage points in most localities. Jen Kiggins flipped the 2nd District, but still underperformed Youngkin by 2 to 3 points in most localities. And the last slide shows that Hung Cao, widely considered to be the least likely of the three to win, actually did the best against Youngkin's benchmark, underperforming 1 to 2 points in most localities. And Cao even overperformed in one locality, in Manassas Park. So that's a look at our data for the evening. I'm now joined by our first panel of political professionals. Representing the Democrats is Kéren Charles Dongo. She managed Senator Tim Kaine's winning 2018 re-election, and she is also a senior member of his congressional staff. Her counterpart in the conversation is Danny Laub. He served as a media consultant in this cycle for both Jen Kiggins and Yesli Vega in the 7th. Danny's a partner in Poolhouse, a Republican media and strategy firm best known in Virginia for its work last year in engineering Governor Glenn Youngkin's victory. Thanks so much to both of you for joining us. So let's start with the data that we just saw. Kéren, did you see anything that surprised you or you found noteworthy in that?
I think nothing surprised me other than realizing how much of the numbers and what they mean. So what we felt on the ground seemed to match some of the numbers. I think, as you said, Mr. Cow's numbers outperforming in Manassas City, I think that surprised me a little bit.
Dan, how about you?
Yeah, I think that's federal elections and state elections are different, and I think you can only compare so much back and forth. Last year was very different than this year in a lot of ways. I think the numbers about the outside spending was fascinating. I think something that was interesting is how much outside spending, as you mentioned, with the TV ad rates between the two DC market, the Norfolk market, but also would be interesting to see the candidate spending. There's huge disparities, and hopefully we'll get into that tonight, among candidate spending as well in all three races.
So, the talk after these midterms is the red wave. So let's talk about that first. The red wave many people were expecting did not really materialize. In Virginia, we saw a split decision in the two most competitive congressional districts. Republicans flipped the 2nd. Democrats were able to hang on to the 7th in Northern Virginia. And in addition, Democrats held on to the 10th, which is anchored in Loudoun County. Danny, how did everybody, including the media, get it so wrong about the red wave?
Well, I think a lot of people get caught up in their own narrative and what they want to see. The truth is that flipping a congressional seat anywhere in the country, but particularly in Virginia, is hard. This idea that Republicans were going to flip 3 seats was really kind of a stretch to begin with. And I think that you have to look at these. We're tempted to paint these races with a broad brush, but these are 3 very different districts in makeup, in how voters react to things and what they feel and believe. And they're, as we saw with the slideshow, they're made up very differently too. And that kind of brings into a whole element of painting this broad brush, since there's, in the 7th, was always going to be a favorable a tilt Democrat to lean Democrat seat. This idea that this was a toss-up race is kind of silly and manufactured. This was always going to be a really tough race to win. The 10th was always going to be a tough race to win, and the 2nd was always going to be a dogfight. So I think people got swept up in the hype.
Swept up in the predicted red wave.
Yeah.
And, well, Kéren, I want to ask you, you were talking about what you felt on the ground. So maybe you sort of sense that red wave wasn't really there, but did Democrats sort of let their base go on believing that?
Well, and that's the interesting part. It's, some of these polls, they only capture a moment in time. So things change, and with our voters, things are continually changing. So in the beginning of the summer, perhaps it felt like Democrats were losing a little bit of our grip. And perhaps sensing that maybe there is a red wave coming helped to motivate Democrats to come out and really work, because Dems did not want to lose this cycle. And so, I think you have to be on the ground to feel each race, to be in each congressional district, to kind of get a sense of what is really actually going to happen.
And Danny, real quick follow-up on that, though. Did it suppress Republican voters at all, thinking that red wave was there?
I don't know. I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think that voters react in different ways, but I think there was an energy, and I think you saw it towards the end of the race in both the 10th and the 7th, but also the 2nd congressional district as well. There was an energy and there was a momentum. It obviously did not end up being enough in key areas, but I think there was a momentum there.
So before, during, after the election, voters talked about inflation. They said it was the top issue. They started feeling the pinch at the gas pump and the grocery store months before Election Day. Republicans across the country laid the blame for inflation at the feet of President Biden and the Democratic-controlled Congress. Corinne, did inflation, though, in the end turned out to be as decisive as people thought it might be?
I think it could have been, but Democrats did something about inflation. So the talking point, rather than just listening to voters complain and share rightfully their distress about inflation, Democrats were able to say, now this is what we've done. We passed the Inflation Reduction Act. I think that was huge for Dems to be able to bring deliverables. Because what happens is voters want to know that you hear them and they want to know that you're able to solve their issue. And I think that really helped build that momentum that we were feeling on the ground, is being able to say, yes, I hear you about gas prices. Here's what we've done. Yes, I hear you about inflation. Here's what we've done. Yes, I hear you about the supply chain. Here's what we've done. And that is something that we saw over and over again. Our candidates were able to stay on message and be able to give that information. And that helped a lot, particularly in the 7th and in the 10th.
Danny, what's your take on that? I mean, you know, I certainly heard Republican candidates talk a lot about inflation. I didn't hear a lot of solutions proposed, though, about what they would do. Was that part of the problem, that it was a complaint and not a problem solved?
Well, I think you have to look at these districts differently. In the 7th and the 2nd in this instance, I think if you look towards the end, the last 3 weeks, Spanberger pivoted her message to a very strong economic message when she ran the entire campaign without talking about it. That tells me when she's running positive economic ads, she's seeing what we saw in the polls. And I saw over a dozen polls, internal polls between the 2nd and the 7th. Inflation was the #1 issue on voters' minds, particularly undecided voters, in every one of those 12 polls. It just is what it is, and I think that Spanberger saw that towards the end, which is where she pivoted her message. I think we didn't see that in the 2nd, where Gloria closed with a January 6th message. And I think that really helped down the final stretch. There was a lot of complexities of the 7th race, which we can get into, but she pivoted to a strong economic closing message that ended up helping her down the stretch.
Interesting. You know, the other big issue was the Dobbs decision, of course. In the nomination contest this spring, Republicans who competed in the state identified themselves as, quote, 100% pro-life. May 3rd, the draft opinion overturning Roe v. Wade was leaked. January 24th, the U.S. Supreme Court decision. And then to add more fuel to the fire, in September, Senator Lindsey Graham announced that he would push for a federal abortion ban at 15 weeks. Danny, how great a political challenge did all of that create for the Republican candidates? And what was your strategy then going forward from that point?
I actually don't think the Dobbs decision impacted these races at all. I think that for cycle after cycle, Republicans are being told, or that Democrats are talking about Republicans in their extreme abortion positions, and I think that happens cycle after cycle. I don't think the Dobbs changed that. I don't think if Dobbs wouldn't have happened, I think the same ads are run against Kiggins, Hunkau, and Yesli Vega. So I don't know the Dobbs decision specifically. I think abortion as a topic was always going to be a factor in these races, and I think as we saw, if you look at the most outside spending, if by ad group, it was in all of these races combined, it was about abortion from the Democrats on Republicans, in the same way that Republicans' top issue on outside spending was inflation in the economy. So obviously, I think it matters. To what extent does it matter? And does it matter more than inflation or more than the economy? I think that's the question of the day. In the 2nd, I think the abortion didn't matter as much in that district as it may have mattered in some of these Northern Virginia places.
Corinne, what do you have?
I think it mattered. I do think it drove turnout and it drove a purpose. And Democratic voters need a purpose. They need a reason to come out and vote. And this was a big reason to come out and vote. Now, I do agree that it probably has a different tilt in the 2nd because, again, Virginia is a big state, but it's not the same everywhere. And how you talk about abortion and choice in the 7th is different from how you should talk about it in the 2nd. And I think the more that Democratic candidates understand those nuances, the better we will be able to do and tap into when there is a moment like Dobbs gave us.
Did it propel swing voters to Democrats in both those districts, or would you argue that happened more in the 7th and the 2nd?
I think, I can't wait to get the nuances of some of the numbers, but I do think it propelled swing voters in the 7th, for sure. I think the combination of choice and the economy and Spanberger's message on the economy and deliverables, solutions, really propelled independence to come our way.
Dan, let me drill down a little bit more, though, in the 7th, the issue that cropped up, after the Dobbs decision. There was another leak of sorts, and that was that audio tape in which Yesli Vega appeared to agree with a woman who questioned whether rape could result in pregnancy. So the Spanberger campaign, as we saw in ad after ad, made that a centerpiece, played that video over and over, or referenced it. I mean, was there any way that Yesli Vega could have overcome that stumble, I guess, on her part?
Yeah, and I think there was, and unfortunately, goes back to being 3 seats and flipping seats is difficult, and the power of incumbency. When all the dust settles here, Spanberger will have outspent Yesli Vega 3.5, 4 to 1. That allowed her to go on TV and define a message. So she was able to take that clip, and this is part of having a good fundraising apparatus and being an incumbent member of Congress. She was able to immediately go on and define Yesli Vega when Yesli Vega couldn't define herself and had to define herself later. So she was playing catch up in the race from a resource allocation. So I would say it got magnified because there was a megaphone behind it, and that megaphone was a large pot of money when Yesli couldn't tell her own story at that point in the race because of her resources.
Another thing that's been discussed a lot in the wake of the midterms is candidate quality. We saw Governor Youngkin won with projecting an image of the friendly suburban dad who, eventually came around to acknowledging that President Biden's election had been legitimate and who at the time avoided taking extreme positions on issues like abortion. So, Kéren, I want to start with you. How much of a help was it to Jennifer Wexton and Abigail Spanberger that Republicans nominated candidates in Northern Virginia who seemed to sympathize with the January 6th insurrectionists and who'd also campaigned with Ted Cruz, who, of course, some voters remembered helped shut down the federal government back in 2013. Was that a big assist?
Look, I think Virginia voters are down the middle voters. In extreme on either side is going to be a problem for a candidate to win in Virginia. And I think it's important that for my purposes, Democratic candidates, that we stay on message, we stay focused, and we don't allow ourselves to be pulled in extreme positions because that's usually not where the voters stand. So I do think that hurt having candidates that are too extreme on the right.
Danny, both Cow and Vega kind of projected this firebrand persona. It seemed like Jen Kiggins cultivated a slightly different public demeanor. In what ways did you try to present her as relatable and neighborly? How important was that image in the overall strategy for her?
Well, first, I'd reject that Yesli is a far-right candidate. I would think she's a down-the-middle candidate that has been portrayed. I think that we have a habit as media and as folks of any Republican is now a far-right crazy person if they don't pass this litmus test that is arbitrary and silly. I think Yesli is a police officer and a mother. In the way she presented herself, she had an ad with her father. She did bilingual ads. If you look at the messages she focused on and what her campaign did, what she did as Prince William County supervisor, I don't know that. I think she is a top-tier recruit. I think she's going to run again in the future. I think that she's an incredible candidate, and she came up short as a first-time candidate, like a lot of them do. But I don't know that I would put her in that category. And when you look at presenting candidates, I think she was presented in a way. She was outflanked from a resource perspective, and there was obviously the tape that didn't help things. I think we can all acknowledge that was an error and became magnified with money. But how Yesli was presented, it was very different than how Jen was presented, but they both, I think, were presented in a way that was, Yesli was presented as a soccer coach. Yesli was presented as a law enforcement officer. And I think that those things were ways to kind of humanize her and connect her with voters. And largely, we saw in polling, really close the gap in a race that we're never supposed to be competitive in. In Jen's race, which has a little different makeup in the beach in Hampton Roads, I think we leaned heavy into Jen's bio as well. Because I think we had two, and I'd put Hung Kao in this category too, but but I can talk most about 2 and 7. 2 incredible candidates, right? So Jen is a Navy helicopter pilot, a state senator who won a very, very tight race in 2019, and a nurse practitioner. She's a mom. We leaned heavily into bio in both of those races because I think they have unique bios and both have bright futures in the party.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I do want to say, because I would be remiss if I didn't, as a slide indicated, Abigail Spanberger had to introduce herself to voters.
The vast majority.
The vast majority of voters. Mm-hmm. And that's a difficult thing to do in a very kind of pressure campaign. And I think she leaned on her voting record, and she leaned in listening to now this new group of voters, what people were looking for, what they wanted, and was able to speak to those needs. And that's why I think one of the reasons she was successful.
$10 million helps too.
And look, I am not one to I'm not one to argue money. Having run campaigns, money is important, but it helps you amplify an already good message.
Kéren, let's talk about Elaine Luria for a minute, too. She was the only member of Congress in this election who put January 6th at the center of her campaign. In her closing message, some people here remember, she declared, quote, "If standing up for what's right means losing an election, so be it." In a district that was overrepresented with active and retired military, was that appeal to duty a possible net plus, or did it end up being kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy?
So I'll say this, I think that was personal to her to want to do that, and I'll never take that away from her. But as a political strategist, I would not be honest if I didn't say that comes into question for that district. It's a district that has challenged Democrats a lot. It takes a lot to win in that district. There's split voters. They go back and forth. It is very much a competitive district, even before redistricting. Redistricting definitely hurt Luria, for sure. There's no question about that. But I appreciate when a candidate has their values, and their values are more important than winning. And I think she made a decision that was really personal and important to her, and I really cannot fault her for that.
But you believe it cost her?
I believe that it probably did not help.
Danny, your thoughts about that before we move to the next question?
It's hard for me to see how Elaine Luria wins that race with or without January 6th being the message. I think, once again, she had all the money in the world. She outspent Congresswoman-elect Kiggins 5-1. I think that her message was off and did not resonate with the voters. I think we continually saw it in polls, but also we saw it on the doors. And every door was tracked with major issues, knocking on undecideds, knocking on independents, knocking out soft Dems and soft Republicans. And nobody brought up January 6th. Such a minuscule amount of folks. So when your TV message, and the former Congresswoman spent $1.2 million on TV in the last week behind a message that nobody at the doors are talking about, there's a disconnect. I think Kéren is right. It was obviously a very personal message to her, and obviously she stated very publicly that if she loses this election, it's what she believes. And it cost her. That was a choice. Obviously, it's the wrong message for the district.
Gotcha. We're going to put you to the test and have a little bit of fun right now. We're going to have a short lightning round, so looking for like 15-second answers right now. And the challenge is I'm going to have you say something nice about the competition. So let's start in the 10th Congressional District. Danny, I'll ask you first. Best thing about Jennifer Wexton?
I think she ran a really smart campaign. She held onto the ball till the clock ran out, and it worked.
Hung Khao, Kéren?
I think he leaned into his service to this nation, and that was important, putting that front and center to the voters.
You guys are doing great on this clock. So in the second, Kéren, I'll start with you. Best move by Jen Kiggins?
Being in tune with what people were talking about in that district and being able to speak their language.
And Danny, you may have, you've said what she did wrong. What did you admire about what she did?
I think some of her positive ads are the best in the country. I think the way that she portrays herself on a positive side is some of the best work, and I've always been impressed by Elaine's ads.
And looking at the 7th, what did you regard as the best move by Abigail Spanberger, Danny?
The early vote, the mail-in vote. where Republicans have not focused on it the way they clearly need to after last year and into this year. She obviously, if you look at the numbers, she capitalized. There's way more than 15 seconds. She capitalized on that in a way that Republicans didn't. It was impressive.
And Kéren, best move by Yesli Vega.
I think she's a hard worker. She went out and really made her case, and not having the same amount of money, she really worked hard and made her case.
Very good, you guys. Good job. Staying. I want to talk, we had two candidates in Cal and Vega that were poised to make history had they been elected. Republicans nominated the most diverse set of congressional candidates Virginia has ever seen. They both had very compelling immigrant backstories to tell to voters. Danny, let me start with you. Vega in particular made a point of targeting immigrants, especially from Central and South America. What did you learn from that, and how successful was she in peeling away Democrats and independents who are first or second generation Americans?
I think the data shows that she was successful in not successful to win the election, but successful in, there's more Democrats than Republicans in the new 7th congressional district. So on paper, so in order to win, you have to peel folks. For a Republican to win, you have to peel a significant amount of folks off. I think she made significant inroads, especially compared to congressional races in the past. Obviously, it wasn't enough to put her over the top. I think candidate quality matters, and I think Republicans need to continue to take rock star candidates like Yesli Vega and good candidates like Hung Cao and candidates like Higgins who have different, unique stories than we've seen Republicans run with in this state before.
Mm-hmm. Kéren, like your boss, Tim Kaine, Abigail Spanberger, speaks Spanish. What was her strategy with the Latino community, and did her campaign learn anything that can be applied in future Virginia elections about that?
Yeah, I mean, her superpower is listening. I think she went in and sat down, small events, building from one small event to the next small event of listening to people and listening to the uniqueness of their community. And I think that's really key. And being able, we talked about it up here, not brushing people with broad brushes and just assuming everybody from this part of the world is the same or has the same issues, but really going in and listening to what are the needs, and then bringing a solution and bringing ideas to the table. So I think that is very, very important. And one thing, I think it's good for Virginia when there are diversity on both sides. It is something that Democrats have definitely leaned into, of making sure up and down the ballot there's some diversity in our bench. And in general, I really think that's just good for Virginia.
I want to talk about sort of a self-interested question, and that is about debates. Because as a journalist, we love debates because it gives us good access to candidates. It makes for good stories. Candidates in the 2nd and the 10th, they faced off in 3 debates, but there was no debate in the 7th after there were 2 failed attempts to broker a meeting between those two. We certainly saw last year in our NBC4 Northern Virginia Chamber debate in the governor's race that had, real consequences. What's your sense about how campaigns are viewing debates right now, whether they're seen as important, or do you think they're sort of, waning as an important part of campaign strategy? And Danny, I'll start with you.
I think every one of these districts in every district across this country is unique and different, and I think you have to approach each race differently. I think ultimately there should have been debates in the 7th, whether there should be 1, 2, 3, or 5. I think there's a level of debate that needs to be had in most of these races. I think it also tells you a lot about the posture of candidates. So you essentially had 2 candidates in the 7th who had different opinions. I mean, there are always ways to end up debating if you want to debate. You saw it in the 10th, you saw it in the 2nd. So the fact that it wasn't a debate in the 7th, I think, was ultimately a disservice to the voters. So.
Kéren, your thoughts about whether debates are still, when you're launching these campaigns and starting to look at all the different variables and strategies, how does that fit in, or have they become at all less important?
Again, I agree that it depends on the region, it depends on the congressional district, it depends on the state, but it also depends on what the voters are asking for and whether the voters feel like they know enough about the candidates. And in this pressure of campaigns, sometimes voters make up their minds and feel like, I don't really need to know more. I don't really need a debate. So I think it really depends. It is still, we got to wait a little bit to see how debates will go, because if we look across the country, there are other campaigns, there are other elections that didn't have debates, and it didn't seem to hurt. So if that's going to be a trend, I don't know.
But maybe not there yet. Okay, so
We're
I can
not
look forward to more as a journalist. It sounds
Yeah.
like.
For now.
I'm going to turn to a couple audience questions now, and the first one, is we're going to jump outside of the 2nd and the 10th and the 7th for just a minute. This question asks: is there a path to electoral success for Democrats in Southwest Virginia? Sometimes it sure doesn't feel like it. Kéren, you want to start with that one?
I'm a big believer, and so is Senator Kaine. We still have to work. We still have to go to Southwest Virginia. It's so important that we make our case. It is so important that we bring solutions to the table. I encourage Dems who are running in Southwest Virginia, do not give up. We have to keep at it. We absolutely have to keep at it. There was a time in history where Prince William County was going red every time. We won that. Where Loudoun was going red every time. We win that now. So my message is absolutely, we're going to keep trying. I'm going to keep going out there, and we're going to keep delivering our message.
Danny, I know you don't want to provide tips to Democrats. What's your take on Southwest?
Well, I would flip it around and say there was a time where Republicans held quite a number of delegate seats in Northern Virginia. I think you have to fight in everywhere across the state. And if I was Democrats, I would continue to fight for those seats in the same way Republicans should fight for seats. And we've seen around the country that, Republicans are winning, D +8, D +9 seats this year, and Democrats are winning Republicans 6, 7, 8 seats this year. You've got to fight everywhere. You never know where you're going to make an unexpected pickup with a really terrific candidate, both on the local level and on the national level.
And let me just say one more thing about that, because we talked about this point earlier. We are entering a time in campaigns where there's less and less of a safe seat. So you just have to keep fighting and delivering solutions for your region, and that's not going to end.
Another question from someone in our audience asks: were you surprised that Hung Kao was the one who came closest to Youngkin's performance? Danny?
No, I don't think so. I think when you look at those numbers, and I don't know exactly when they were polled, that margin is widening as ballots are continuing to be counted. But we're at a place now where the governor won both the 2nd and the 7th. He obviously lost the 10th. So mathematically speaking, I think it made sense if one was betting on the district to be the closest on that ratio, that would be the 10th.
Kéren, any thoughts on that?
Look, I think the message for Democrats is, again, we can't, like my last point, we can't take anything for granted. And so we have to make sure where there are weaknesses that we shore up those weaknesses, and we do that quickly.
Next question from an audience member: how much, if at all, did redistricting contribute to the outcome of the election? You've talked about this a little bit already, but maybe to dig a little deeper on that. And they say they're thinking about Lurie in particular. Danny?
Yeah, and there's no doubt about it that district got more Republican. I would say that didn't. I think it's a very simplistic point of view to say that that's why she lost and why the Congressman-elect Higgins won. Do I think it was a factor? Do I think it got more Republican? Absolutely. You can't deny that, and that's kind of how it goes. But I don't know that ended up being the tipping point of the race. I think it was a contributing factor.
Yeah, it definitely got more Republican, and it's going to require a very concerted, focused effort of Dems building our infrastructure down in the 2nd if we want to flip it back.
This question says, how can this might be for me, but I'll see what you guys have to say about it. How can the media stress the importance of unofficial results on election night? This person says, looking at the elect spreadsheet and the changes on 11/18, it has 2,300 entries. I mean, I don't know that was perceived as a problem on this election night. What about either of you.
No, I mean, look, we're accustomed to waiting. Each of the camps have their boiler rooms, so we get a sense of knowing what's going on. And I think we're as a nation and as a Commonwealth, people wait for the official decision and not jump to too many conclusions. But we're pretty, accustomed to waiting till the numbers come in.
Mm-hmm. Were there any issues that cropped up from your perspective about that, about results being portrayed as official when they weren't yet, or?
I don't think so. I think election nights are always roller coasters, especially the way precincts come in and the way counties and localities come in. And I think it's about making campaigns need to make smart decisions at the right time. And obviously, as she said, there's boiler rooms and looking at indicator precincts and stuff. But I don't think that was an issue. We knew where every major election in the Commonwealth stood on Tuesday, some earlier in the night than others, but we knew. And I think that a lot of people had a lot of confidence in these elections, and I think that's very positive.
I was asking you earlier about the surprises that you saw in the data, and this wasn't in the data, but the thing that surprised me most election night, I focused on the 7th District congressional race, and that was what happened in Stafford County. I thought that was, very interesting. That's a county that is changing demographically, but still has typically trended red. It was almost a dead heat in Stafford. Could you both talk about that a little bit and what you see happening there, and is that Northern Virginia blue creeping deeper into the exurbs? Kéren?
We are working hard in Stafford County, have been since 2018, and been successful there, and we'll continue to work really hard. And I think it's because, again, our formula for winning is staying on message, bringing deliverables, and bringing it directly to the voter. And I'm really excited for what we're able to do, and I think there'll be more to come. I think Stafford will be one of those places, just Prince William County, Loudoun County, Stafford County, and we'll continue going and get those Southwest as well. Don't laugh. I believe.
But
she said optimistically.
There's not a strong path for Republicans to win the 7th without Stafford. So
right.
That's a problem. And until Republicans can take a hold, and there's not just Stafford, there's a few other ones that I won't name, localities across the Commonwealth that need work. And if Republicans are going to win these seats, it's critical to the math. Mm-hmm. There's no other way to cut it.
Mm-hmm. Were you surprised by that outcome too?
I don't know that I would say I was surprised. We had data previously that said that Stafford was going to be closer than I guess we would have wanted it to be. So it wasn't shocking, but it's a concerning element as part of putting the coalition of votes a Republican needs to win in a Democrat district, which the 7th is. The math gets really tough when you lose Stafford.
The other thing that surprised me, I'm sure my bosses at NBC were quite happy to see all that ad revenue, but just the incredible saturation in this cycle. I think every one of our breaks was packed with ads. Is there something changing on that front, or was it because there was a lot of this outside money coming in to be spent?
Yeah, I think outside money definitely affects a lot. But one thing I'll say about Stafford too, that Senator Kaine and Representative Spanberger did an event, I think either a week before the election, and the turnout and the energy gave me an indication that this is going to go well for us. So I tend to really feel that on the ground more than the ads, because at some point it's oversaturation. Mm-hmm.
We saw it on the polling in both. I saw in the polling in both the 2nd and the 7th. There wasn't that many undecided voters, right? So in these races, there's millions and millions of dollars being spent every week on the outside towards the end in October and in September. But you're fighting over a small piece of land in a lot of these races, and you're looking at races internally that are at 45, 45, 46, 47, 47, 45, right? The amount of voters you're really arguing over is small, and the outside spending is heavy, but there's no replacement for a candidate telling their story. Whether that story is told on a third-party testimonial, whether that story is told by the candidate themselves, but outside groups can never make up for the lack of funding of a candidate to tell their own story. They can throw a lot of mud and do a lot of contrasting. But at the end of the day, you're fighting over a small sliver, and it can't replace what only a candidate can do for themselves.
Mm-hmm. And don't forget, Virginia has 45 days of early voting now. So ads are still going, but people have already voted and moved on. Yeah, exactly.
It's election season, not election day.
And moved on. So that takes, you have to think about that as well.
Yeah. I want to ask you about something that really interests me, and that is ranked choice voting, which we're hearing more and more about, not only in Virginia, across the country. You had a candidate in Hunkow that was selected that way. I know Republicans felt that in using ranked choice voting in nominating Glenn Youngkin, it was very successful in producing a candidate that had support in one fashion or another from everybody who voted in that multi-candidate race. Arlington County is thinking about doing it now in one of their upcoming municipal elections. Danny, what do you think about the future of ranked choice voting in Virginia?
I'm personally not a fan of it. I think primaries, the way that we've always elected people in this country, should continue to elect people in this country. I'm not a fan of ranked choice voting. I know there's quite a lot of people in the Republican Party that are. I still think we should have heads-up primaries.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, before I hear from you, Kéren, do you think that in the 10th, though, do you think it still produced the best candidate there, or do you think a primary might have resulted in someone that could have run closer?
The best candidate is a subjective frame. I don't know necessarily there, but I feel like generally speaking, primaries give us better candidates that can win a general election and have won general elections.
And look, I think for Democrats in Virginia, primaries have served us well. So if it isn't broken, don't fix it. But again, a lot of these things, we as strategists, we could come up with different ideas and think what will work for our particular candidates. But at the end of the day, it's really up to the electorate. So I don't have too much of a strong opinion either way, other than we've been very fortunate in primaries.
Kéren mentioned early voting a minute ago, and I sensed a difference in this cycle on the part of the Republican Party, whereas we see in other places in the country where it's discouraged. Now, every time I covered Glenn Youngkin in this cycle, I mean, he, time and time again at these rallies, he was encouraging people to go ahead and cast their vote in the moment. I have to tell you, though, a lot of the Republicans I spoke to in those audiences said, "No, I'm not going till Election Day." I mean, Danny, is the Republican Party in Virginia retooling its message on that, and must they retool the message on that? What did you see in this cycle?
Yeah, absolutely, and we saw it last year in the governor's race. The governor feels very strongly about early voting, invested a lot of both resources, staff, and message discipline last year into early voting. He obviously, it's something that's very important to him even today, as you saw with these get out the vote rallies across the state. I think there is a lot of information flow problems when you have voters that are so resistant for a variety of reasons to do that. And I think there needs to be continuing campaigns, need a Republican campaign specifically. The Democrats have been better at this than we have, of understanding that it's a 45-day election season, getting their people to vote by mail, getting their people to vote early, bank those votes ahead of time. And unless more folks look at what Governor Youngkin is doing and what he did last year and run campaigns in a similar way, they're going to continue to get lapped and lapped and lapped by Democrats who just bank votes.
And Democrats have been on board all along.
Yeah, and I want to give credit where credit is due, in particular to our local committee, Prince William County Local Committee, really has just a very strong infrastructure on how to get our voters to early vote and making sure that it's done. So I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that when we have strong local committees, these are some things that they really could help with, and it takes a little bit of pressure off of the campaigns committee.
And one of the things I want to ask about, again, just something that the rallies that Glenn Youngkin, I mean, he was tireless in headlining those things, and they had anywhere from 12 people to a couple of hundred people. Democrats, told me over and over again that they were really focusing on the ground game, on the canvassing, and that's the approach that we saw them take. Kéren, let me start with you. I mean, do you think the rallies paid off for Republicans, or is some of that wasted effort? and money?
I mean, it's hard for me to answer that because, not being in their boiler room, I don't know what the strategy was, but I can tell you for the Democratic strategy, it was so important that we had the Canvas kickoffs because we needed volunteers to take the message to the door. Again, because Representative Spanberger was new to the region, because we wanted to shore up the 10th, because we were desperate in the second, knowing that we were already coming into that race at a deficit because the second had gotten more Republican. So it was a very clear strategy to do more Canvas kickoffs. Senator Kaine did a number of kickoffs. Senator Warner did a number, and that was by design because we needed to get to the doors.
Danny, what about you? Were those rallies worth it to fire up the base, or was that maybe could have been redirected?
Well, I think the bigger point is if you look at any poll in Virginia, the most popular politician in the state is Governor Youngkin. If you look from a favorability standpoint, especially among Republicans, but statewide right now, and I think that he was holding events at near or at early vote sites in all these districts with a very popular figure who just won an historic election last year. I think it was absolutely the right move. I don't think it should replace door knocking. It should not replace small roundtables on issues. It should not replace anything. But as a part of a holistic campaign, I think between the governor's efforts in these races and going all in, I think that it paid off. It may not have paid off in a victory sense for some of these, but it definitely helped, and it definitely did not hurt, and helped close some of these gaps here. Absolutely, and it allowed candidates in Hung Cao and in Yesli Vega and in Senator Kiggins, not Congressman-elect Kiggins, who were unknown to large swaths of the district. Right, it allowed them to help be introduced. So I think that was a huge positive.
Great. Well, I wish we had time for even more questions. We could go on even longer, but we have to take a break and get our next panel up here. So our thanks to Kéren Charles Dongo and to Danny Laub for joining us for this very frank conversation. Really insightful. Thanks to both of you.
Thanks for having me.
Purpose-driven company. It extends well beyond just toothpaste on a shelf. Being partnered with Walmart, it's an amazing opportunity.
We immediately went to, I can't wait to see the impact that we're going to have.
When Walmart invests in us, we're able to invest in veterans by providing employment opportunities here in the U.S.
As a veteran myself, I'm thrilled that we're going to make a bigger difference.
The lives that it's going to change, that's what drives us every day.
In these divided times, people are less willing to trust what they read, particularly when it comes to politics. In Virginia, there's a fiercely nonpartisan group that takes a different approach. The Virginia Public Access Project, known as VPAP, is a nonprofit that organizes verifiable facts so you can see for yourself and reach your own conclusions. Our premise is simple, that an informed electorate is key to a vibrant democracy. We don't lobby or take positions on the issues. We are committed to accuracy. Our mission is to elevate public understanding by presenting factual information in ways that are easily understood and free of partisan bias. Our services are free and available to anyone. We are funded by our users who come from across the political spectrum. See for yourself at vpap.org, where you'll find information about Virginia politics that's designed to inform, not inflame. VPAP's work is made possible by donors like you. Thank you.
Small businesses really is the backbone of America.
Walmart is the biggest retailer in the world, and to be a part of that, oh God, it's so inspirational. When we get a deal with Walmart, then we're able to help someone with a job.
Not only are we making our lives better, but all those that's in our community. It's what dreams are made of.
Call us different.
Because we are
Different in where we come from,
where we're going,
and how we think.
but the same in our dreams for tomorrow.
We are united and driven by the pull of possibility.
To inspire,
To think fearlessly. To protect and to heal the planet. We know the world will change.
because together,
We will be the ones to change it.
so yeah, call Mason different. All
Together different.
I'm joined now by two well-known and well-respected political analysts. We'll be looking ahead to what the midterm results may mean for Virginia politics, especially in next year's General Assembly elections. Mark Rozell is the Dean of the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, and Bob Holsworth is a longtime political observer and commentator and the managing partner at DecideSmart. Before we look ahead, though, to how the midterms are going to influence Virginia next year, other thoughts that you have about what Kéren and Danny had to say?
So there are two prominent Republicans who I think were an overwhelming presence in this election campaign this year. The former President of the United States, who's going to be making an announcement later tonight about his political future, which had the effect of putting him constantly on the radar of voters in Virginia and around the country. Typically in a midterm election cycle, the election is primarily about the party in the White House, the president's public standing, state of the economy. The party in the White House typically loses a large number of seats in the House of Representatives. The out party has all the advantages. But in this election cycle, the former president of the United States with such a constant presence, I think it gave an additional motivation to Democratic-based voters who normally lack the kind of intense motivation that they would have in a presidential election year when their party is holding the White House in a midterm election cycle. And then, of course, there is Governor Glenn Youngkin, who staked a lot of his political capital in this election cycle in trying to push that red wave, beginning in Virginia and throughout the country, as he was saying, by helping the candidates in the competitive races that we just talked about, 7th, 10th, and 2nd districts in Virginia, and yet the outcome was rather ordinary. The Democratic-leaning District of 10th went Democrat. The 7th district that everybody expected leaned Democrat, and there would have to be a real big Republican wave to change that one, also went Democrat. And the 2nd district, which leans significantly enough Republican that I think even incumbent Elaine Luria doubted her prospects for re-election, went Republican. But Glenn Youngkin, I think, in campaigning so frequently, relentlessly out of state, including for some MAGA Republican election deniers, I believe had an impact on his public repute in Virginia and his ability to transfer his popularity in this election cycle to Republican candidates in order to persuade not only a big Republican base turnout, but also to get those swing voters he was so successful at luring in the 2021 election cycle, and that just did not happen this time.
And those two candidates, by and large, avoided talking about Trump. In fact, when he did his endorsement of Yesli Vega somewhat late in the campaign, she didn't have much to say about it, but still, you believe Trump was on voters' minds and influenced their decisions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, what I was thinking is that if you look back at the elections from 2016 to 2020, all of those elections were dominated by Donald Trump. And the Democrats did really well, better than you might say they should have in Virginia. In 2021, when Glenn Youngkin won and the Republicans took the House, my sense was that was a pandemic election, that people were extraordinarily frustrated with remote learning. They were now experiencing shortages, and inflation was coming, and the Democrats were slow to respond. And in some ways, that election really, I think, inflated Republican expectations a little higher than they should have been in Virginia, particularly in Northern Virginia. Because largely I think that neither Yesli Vega nor Hung Cao, who had these wonderful personal stories, were great candidates for the region in that sense. And the other point that we saw early in the data is that overall, Virginia went back to kind of normalcy in the votes, where all of those districts, we found that Glenn Youngkin's performance was higher than the performance of these congressional candidates there. So I thought we kind of went back to sort of normal times there. And what we saw from 16 through 20 is that the Democrats had an inflated sense of how they were performing that I think might have been evident in McAuliffe's performance in 21. And then I think the Republicans, in nominating Hung Cao and Yesli Vega, weren't really attentive to what was happening in Northern Virginia. And I'll just give one example. If you look at some of the conservative national news media, you would think that Loudoun County is the centerpiece of political debate in this country. When McAuliffe ran the first time in 2013, he carried it by 4.5 points. When he ran in 2021 against Glenn Youngkin, he carried it by 11. That in Northern Virginia, in Loudoun, Fairfax, and Prince William, Youngkin ran behind Ken Cuccinelli. And so for all of a sudden to think that candidates like Yesli Vega or Hung Cao were going to win in this region, I think was the same type of sort of inflationary expectation that the Democrats suffered from after, in the post-Trump election.
Interesting, interesting. You've spoken to it already, but it's clear that Virginia elections are not isolated from, mic problem, national politics. Our off-year state elections have become federalized to some degree at least. How much will what happened then in these midterms influence how General Assembly candidates wage their campaigns coming up? And we'll see if your mic works, Mark.
Oh, so the mic wasn't working last time. So
I'm sure we heard you on the other mic, though.
Okay. And are you getting me on this one now? Yes. Okay, otherwise I'll just speak up, even with my weak voice today.
Yeah, how much impact will the midterms have on what we see play out now in the General Assembly races coming up?
These were federal elections, and as I said before, national trends, the presence of the former president as a factor, I think were much greater. That's going to be significantly less in state elections in an odd year election cycle. So there's a lot of very odd factors also going into the elections next year with the redistricting, all of these incumbents who have been pitted against each other now in different districts, which means there's probably going to be very significant turnover. I think the elections will turn much more on local issues and personalities than you typically see in a midterm election year, where the national context is just such an overwhelming influence, even on the individual district races in the House of Representatives.
And we'll break down some of those things issue by issue in a minute. But Bob, what do you think? I mean, do you think some General Assembly candidates right now are starting to retool or regroup from maybe what they expected to do, based on what's happened in the midterms?
Yeah, I think it will certainly depend on what region of the state they're in, because that will have a dramatic impact on who can win and what kind of message is going to resonate across these various districts in Virginia. I do think there are a couple of issues or items that may help to nationalize this to some degree. First, I think in some ways the media will read it as the first election of 2024 in that front. They'll be looking at for these elections. Secondly, you have a governor who may be involved in a national campaign in this sense. We don't exactly know that right now, what his feeling is, but certainly he hasn't denied that he would be actually running nationally, and if that happens, that's going to have, I think, a very significant impact on what we see coming forward. And certainly in some of these competitive districts that are going to emerge, we're going to see these issues come up. Republicans are going to continue to emphasize the Parents Matter issue that won again in Virginia Beach school board elections here, largely because it's been one that was a signature issue of Glenn Youngkin. They're thinking that it gives them an advantage on an issue which they've always played from behind on. And at the same time, if you think of some of these districts that are going to occur, Schuyler Van Valkenburg in the Richmond area running against Siobhan Donovan, he is going to put, as he already did in his announcement, the abortion issue front and center. So my sense is that some of the issues will emerge. They won't emerge in every race, but they'll emerge in some. And then finally, we have this whole issue hovering over us, is whether or not Glenn Youngkin is really going to try for the presidency. And if he does, the timetable is not too good for him, I don't think, in terms of what will happen in Virginia. We only had one governor who's done that recently. That was Doug Wilder, after he won a high-profile election. And he has said to this day that perhaps the biggest mistake he made was running for president in 1992.
I want to touch on some of those other issues in a minute, but you just alluded to it. The 2023 General Assembly elections will be happening just at the time that the presidential contest is kicking into high gear. We're already seeing some Republicans nationally and in the Commonwealth turning away from Donald Trump, calling on the party to move on. How do you think the General Assembly candidates are going to navigate that? Are they going to follow Glenn Youngkin's example and sort of keep Donald Trump at arm's length? Will they cut him off altogether, or will they avoid talking about Trump and instead talk about Glenn Youngkin and the successes he's had in Virginia as the GOP leader? Mark?
That depends on the district. That depends upon the part of the state. And some parts of the state, running as a Trump Republican will be effective for many Republicans.
And you think will continue to be through next year?
Absolutely, will continue. And, in answer to your question, whether it's a smart strategy to continue to cultivate the Trump base or to be more like Youngkin and keep it a bit at a distance and try to thread that needle, certainly for a general election cycle, the latter is the much greater strategy. And Youngkin running statewide, that was by far the much more secure strategy to being elected. But these Republican candidates who aspire to a House of Delegates or Senate seat have to get nominated. And within the Republican Party, with these relatively small turnout nomination processes, the path to nomination may be through the Trump wing of the Republican Party, even though that may not be the best path to victory in the general election. No different than what we saw in the national elections this year, of course, where a number of Trump-endorsed Republicans or Republicans who ran as election deniers were able to get a party nomination and ultimately ended up losing, and the Republicans ended up severely underperforming by historical standards.
Bob, what do you expect?
Yeah, this could turn out to be a real serious challenge for Republican candidates for a couple of reasons, I believe. The first is that Donald Trump is likely to be out there front and center himself on this, and if not dominating the political arena like he did before, certainly being very prominent. Secondly, we've already seen people in the Republican Party on the conservative wing take positions very different than Glenn Youngkin's appeal to the Trump base without actually hugging Donald Trump. We saw the Lieutenant Governor Winston Sears say he's just bad news, I'm not supporting him. Tim Anderson in Virginia Beach taken the same perspective and has now gotten into a brawl with the senator that he was an attorney for, Amanda Chase. So it just seems to me that it's going to be more difficult with Trump front and center for Republicans to simply take the Youngkin position. And then finally, if Youngkin's in the race, what do you say? I think at that point, they're going to attach themselves to Youngkin rather than Trump.
Can I tell you how many Republicans I've heard from who have said that Winston Sears tanked her future political aspirations as a Republican for statewide office?
Really, really interesting. Interesting.
I don't know if that's accurate, but she took a principled stand, right? Saying it's time to move beyond the former president. But many Republican folks I've talked to said they don't think that's the right strategy for somebody who's looking for a party nomination within the current Republican Party, and that may have severely hurt her chances to move up in the next election cycle if that's what she had planned to do.
Interesting. Let's look a little closer at some of the top issues that will likely emerge in the 2023 General Assembly races. And you touched on abortion, but how much will abortion rights continue to dominate the conversation, especially when there is a push to enact a 15-week restriction in Virginia, and obviously if the Senate flips over to Republican control, that could very well be a reality. So how much will abortion rights be part of the conversation?
I think it's going to be a huge part of the conversation. This is now a state issue, and the governor is on record as favoring a restriction on abortion to only allowing the first 15 weeks. Hugely controversial. I cannot imagine that Democrats would not play this issue very aggressively in their elections next year. The sleeper issue actually was abortion in this election cycle. You look at the pre-election polls, it was not showing up as one of the top issues of voter motivation, but the exit polls showed something very different. The exit polling data showed that it was as much as a number 2 issue in terms of voter motivation, and the vote turnout was decidedly in one direction, particularly among young voters who turned out in big numbers and did so heavily for Democrats.
Yeah. And I will say anecdotally, nearly every Democratic voter I interviewed over that 45 days said that abortion was the driving reason that they were casting their ballot and casting it for Democrats. So what do Republican General Assembly candidates do with the abortion issue, Bob? And I know it will depend on where they are in the Commonwealth.
Some places they're going to call the Democrats extreme. I've seen some polling that suggests that the 15-week ban is actually in and of itself not that unpopular. The challenge is that the Democrats are likely to portray that position just as the Republicans portray Democratic positions on gun control as sort of the first step towards something else. So the governor is saying, well, I want to reach a compromise on this, and this 15 weeks is a compromise. At the same time, however, the Democrats, what they'll do is they'll point to statements saying, well, I will gleefully sign any pro-life legislation that comes my way. The Democrats are going to argue this is simply the first step in an effort to actually ban it, and they're going to make that an issue, particularly in the suburban areas. I think it's going to be a troublesome issue for the Republicans in Northern Virginia. I think it'd be troublesome in RVA. And it'll be interesting to see how it plays out in Hampton Roads, because that's the place where Glenn Youngkin is extremely popular. He did extremely well in the election in Hampton Roads, far better than he did in Northern Virginia. And that's the place where the Republicans flipped 2 or 3 seats in the last House election. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I think in Northern Virginia it's going to play out dramatically to the advantage of the Democrats. I'm not sure how it's going to play out in Hampton Roads.
Did you have another word on that, Mark?
Well, the context has changed entirely, of course, because of the Supreme Court decision. Republicans used to be able to say, in response to characterizations of being extremists, that they support precedent, constitutional law, and that they favor secondary restrictions on abortion, no taxpayer funding, parental notification, parental consent, no late-term abortions. And look at those Democrats, they're the extremists. They won't even accept reasonable restrictions on abortion. But now that's all been thrown away by the Supreme Court decision, because the whole argument of saying I favor constitutional precedent is gone. And now their position has been completely laid bare, and they can't run away from it. They can't disguise it as they used to. And that's, I think, what makes it fundamentally different now, in that it's a federalism issue. It belongs to the states. It's going to be a very big issue in elections next year. And we saw the women vote and the young vote in this election cycle skyrocket, particularly with the young vote. And the young female vote, I think it was close to 3-1 Democratic. So I think these are very telling data as to the challenges that Republican candidates are going to have in the General Assembly elections next year.
Let's talk more about parents' rights. The parents' rights narrative certainly helped Glenn Youngkin win in 2021, but we saw in the midterms its effectiveness kind of had mixed results. I mean, in Northern Virginia, it didn't seem to gain much traction for Yesli Vega or Hung Cao, but as you mentioned, Bob, in Virginia Beach, it enabled conservatives to take a majority on the school board, and in fact, in Loudoun County, conservatives picked up 1 seat with someone who was a parents' rights candidate. So how do you think it's going to play in 2023? Is it still going to continue to be something that a lot of candidates, and particularly Republican candidates, are talking about?
Well, I think it's going to play out first and foremost in the General Assembly session. And I think where you're going to see Republicans take it in some fashion is in the culture war issues, particularly with respect to the treatment of transgender kids. We've seen this throughout localities in Virginia. These school board meetings are filled with controversy about this issue. The Republicans believe that it works in their benefit across the state. I think you're going to see a lot of legislation about this. I know even, for example, I was speaking at an event the other night where people who represent the University of Virginia and their hospital think that there's going to be legislation that targets public hospitals that provide treatment for transgender teens. I just think you're going to see more and more of that issue come up, and I believe it's going to be central to the General Assembly session. I'm not sure exactly how many people want to run on it, but if anyone thinks that these culture war issues are going away, I think they're going to be more prominent rather than less prominent.
Mark?
And many voters, I think, will see that as a diversion from many of the core issues that are absolutely key to voters' frustrations. Economists tell me we're going to have a recession next year, right? There's a lot of concern about the state of the economy, state spending, core issues that I think this election cycle showed are really what motivate voters. And if the Republicans are going to play the culture wars issues, that's going to do really well to motivate their base. But I'm not sure the base is large enough in order to overwhelm, I think, these other more key issues to the electorate that are bound to dominate the conversation next year.
So I want to look at redistricting and its impact, because that's going to be potentially enormous. So nonpartisan redistricting, a first in Virginia. What's the impact that is going to have, just first and foremost, on who controls the House and the Senate, do you think?
Well, let me say first, I think the Democrats who supported that rue the day they ever did. I think this may be the only party in the country in which a significant portion of people controlled the governorship, the Senate, and the House, and gave that power up. Pretty remarkable that they did that. So now what's happened as a result is that the Supreme Court not only engaged in a redistricting, but they engaged in what I would call a maximalist redistricting. They didn't consider any incumbent address in that redistricting. So what that led to was, almost 40% of folks at one time at the beginning being tossed into districts with one another. And that's going to lead to tremendous uncertainty. You have Democrats running against Democrats in primaries. You have a couple of instances where Republicans are going to be running in Republicans. And you have a lot of instances where people are running entirely in districts that are kind of new. And one thing that I know about elected officials, they typically know their district very well from the school board on. You can go to any street and they can tell you, how it votes, what it looks like. They don't always know that right now. So that's going to lead to tremendous uncertainty, I think, in this election. We can already say there's going to be a couple of places where there's going to be clear fights. Can John Edwards keep his Senate seat in Roanoke? Can Siobhan Donovan keep her seat in a district that's become more Democratic? But even beyond that, I think we're going to see a lot of turnover and uncertainty as this election season goes forward, more so than I can ever remember in the Virginia General Assembly.
Yeah, I've seen at least one delegate sell his house already.
Right. Well, if you were a fan, by the way, of term limits and you're unhappy that it never happened, you're getting a version of that now.
So Mark, with the scramble underway then, do you think we're going to see historic turnover?
The short answer is yes. Yeah, no doubt about it. Maybe, some people want turnover, right?
And then how does it impact who takes control, though, of the House and Senate? That's not as easy to answer.
What do you think? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think it's so easy to answer because what you've seen is that there are a lot of districts where the incumbent situation got better for them and got better for their party. VPAP has done a great job in putting that out. There are some places where it didn't change very much, but there are a number of places where it did change and you have more competition right now. So ultimately, I think it's going to come down to 3 or 4 seats in the Senate, 6 or 8 seats in the House. It's going to depend on the quality of the candidate, the quality of the messaging, and the money. And that's the one other thing I want to mention about that is changing in this season. Over the last 2 House cycles, the Democrats had a huge financial advantage over the Republicans. That may not exist this time because the Republicans have this premier fundraiser sitting in the governor's office in Glenn Youngkin, who is going to bring in, I think, most of the Virginia business money this time is going to support Republicans for the most part, I believe. So it's going to be up to the Democrats, actually, to get national money in, which they have done fairly successfully in the last 2 cycles. But to be competitive with the Republicans this time, they're going to have to do that. And I don't see a situation, as we saw in 17 and the last 2 cycles, 19 and 21, where the Democrats had a clear financial advantage over the Republicans in these House races.
Yeah, good point. We have a special election coming up almost as soon as we flip the calendar page to January, and that is to fill Jan Kagan's state Senate seat. They just set the date, January 10th. What's at stake in that special election? Mark, do you have any thought?
It's the first test post midterm elections and first test for the state elections going into next year for sure. So symbolically, I think it'll be very important, but beyond that, I don't know.
The couple of things I think are at stake is that if it remains 21-19, the Democrats still have to worry about people being picked off. Linwood Lewis, whose district got much worse in redistricting. And then there's always the concern about whether on abortion issues, a pro-life Democrat like Joe Morrissey, if an issue came to the floor, if it got past the committee and could actually be put on the floor, would he side with the governor and the Republicans? So those kind of matters, I think, will be there. And the Democrats, they haven't done well in Hampton Roads. I think they have a great candidate in Aaron Rouse, but we'll have to see whether or not they can withstand a trend that has been harming them. If you took a look at the 21 election, I think Martha Mugler lost to A.C. Cordoza, despite the fact that she raised $600,000 and he raised $50,000. And they still lost in Hampton Roads. So this is a place where the Democrats would really like to make a positive statement because they have been on the defensive, I think, since the Youngkin election in that region of the state.
Yeah. So you would expect them to probably devote, even though this is a very short time frame, to devote some real resources and attention to that race, seeing it as perhaps a hedge against other Democrats being picked off on the abortion issue.
Interestingly enough, when Aaron Rouse made his announcement today, Elaine Luria was by his side. It came with a this huge laundry list of Democrats who are supporting him. This is an election they're taking very seriously, and you can be certain that Glenn Youngkin will as well.
And will abortion rights be the top issue for the Democrats as they wage that race?
I think you have to be concerned about whether that really works in
that area.
In
Okay, so a little bit different than what
the,
you might see if it
the
were in
number
Northern
one issue
Virginia.
there or not.
I want to ask you both to talk a little bit. I've talked to you offline about this a little bit about Abigail Spanberger, and in the wake of her election to this third term, and the ability that she had to really, win over again all these new voters. What do you see in her future? I mean, does her political stock go up with this latest victory? Mark, what do you think?
She ran a really smart campaign, and her stock clearly goes up. Having to introduce herself to a predominantly new constituency and to be able to win as she did, I think gives a lot of oxygen to those who have been talking about her as a potential statewide candidate for the Democrats. And she might just have the right stuff, the right framework as a Democrat statewide in Virginia, in that she projects an image of being very independent. She differed with the leadership of her party in Congress, came out against the leader, the leader of her party, in fact. I suppose there was a wink, wink, nod, nod between her and the Speaker of the House, go out and do what you have to get elected. But, she played it very much in the middle politically, and it worked well in her district, and she showed herself to be an incredibly effective campaigner. So I would not be surprised if there's a lot of additional chatter about recruiting her to run for statewide office 2025 perhaps.
Bob, share that view? Or?
Oh, exactly. If you take a look at Spanberger's history now, she's won 3 races.
3 different districts.
Yeah, in very tough districts for Democrats. She's an extraordinarily effective campaigner. When she ran in the district that was centered in Western Henrico and Western Chesterfield in the Richmond area, I was just stunned by how many volunteers she was able to generate. The army of volunteers, the army of young people and of women who went out there and just supported her every day, did the phone banking, the knocking on the doors. And then she goes out in an entirely new district and wins again. It's hard for me to imagine that the Democrats, that at least right now on the statewide level, don't have a very clear bench, can't look at her as somebody who really could win statewide, would be their strongest candidate statewide, given that she's run in 2 districts that are not necessarily totally Democratic districts at all.
You've spoken to it a little bit, but let's look at Glenn Youngkin. He put a lot of political capital out there in these midterms, paid off in the 2nd, didn't so much in the 7th and 10th. I've had some suggest to me, that's what's expected of the person who is perceived as the party leader. So win or lose, putting himself out there was what you have to do. Do you think his political stock was diminished at all through this, or was it, sort of an overall, perceived as an overall help, at least among Republicans?
Well, I think it helped him among Republicans for sure, but he went all out in those 3 races, and a number of others. He campaigned as well, and put a little bit of his political stock on the line. He talked about leading a major red wave that was going to start in Virginia and spread throughout the country. Okay, that certainly didn't happen. On the other hand, to be fair, the 10th district, I think, was always the longest of long shots. The 7th district, I think, was very difficult, and most of us did not expect any different outcome. I think even Elaine Luria didn't expect a different outcome in the 2nd district. So I'm really not sure how much of a difference he could have made, but I've said before, I think the bigger reputational risk he has taken is his relentless campaigning out of state, campaigning on behalf of people such as Kari Lake, election deniers. He now owns that. He threaded the needle beautifully in 2021. He was able to maintain the MAGA base while at the same time appeal to swing voters, be seen as a generally benign conservative Republican, not a Trump acolyte. And people nationally talked about him as representing perhaps the future of the Republican Party in his ability to thread the needle in the way that he did. But I think he's more so shown his colors recently by the people he's campaigned for out of state. And I don't think it's been entirely popular with Virginians, the amount of time that their governor is spending outside of the Commonwealth. Bob and I remember Doug Wilder in 1992, there was a popular bumper sticker in Virginia, Wilder for resident. Okay,
but
people got annoyed about the guy. He gets elected and suddenly he's going national and he's out of state all the time campaigning. Why is the governor not here governing? And that was a fraction, by the way, of what Glenn Youngkin's been doing. So Youngkin for resident.
Is there a difference between that, though? We remember when Tim Kaine was governor, he was head of the DNC. He was traveling around. That was later in his term. It wasn't within his first year. But Bob, is there a difference then? And does this really
if you're actually campaigning for president? Both Tim Kaine and Jim Gilmore took jobs as head of their respective national parties or national committees during their governorship. But I think that's a little different than actually announcing I might run for president. And as I said, that's the timetable, because of the legislative session, is problematic, because people are going to be announcing, maybe tonight, and then, further on, early 2023, if he's going to get in the race that's there. At the same time, let's be honest about it as well. If he doesn't announce and he continues to do fairly well as governor with the public, he's going to be automatically shortlist candidate for vice president for any Republican candidate there. So he has a couple of national opportunities. One, does he take the big risk and run for president? Two, does he try to maneuver himself into a short list for the vice presidency? And we'll have to see how that works out. Polling in Virginia, until recently, he still looks pretty good on that front. But if you go for national office before you serve your 4-year term, that's a bigger risk.
We're getting kind of tight on time. We have time for a couple more questions. Biggest surprise for each of you in the midterm results in Virginia, Mark?
No surprise. No surprise. It was
You
my
knew it all
surprise.
along.
Yeah, yeah. I
What
mean,
about you?
every district turned out exactly as expected.
How about in that data? Anything strike you particularly that you didn't expect to see?
No, yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't so much what I expectations, but I think it is clear that the sort of impetus behind the Youngkin campaign has moderated somewhat, and that he wasn't able to transfer that to candidates like Vega and Hung Cao, which I think would have been a big surprise if that had happened, because of the positions they had staked out and in the region of the state where they're running.
By the way, I should be fair to Youngkin on this point, because I said he did some damage, I believe, reputationally by campaigning for some of these MAGA Republicans around the country. Donald Trump has now done a good job of kind of bringing him back a little bit by criticizing Glenn Youngkin and perhaps helping him a little bit there.
And last question, how many red vests are we going to see on General Assembly candidates in this upcoming year?
Yeah, we'll have to see whether that is the signature sartorial move in Virginia in 2023.
Mark, you think so? You think you'll see that on a lot of Republican candidates? No?
No red vests.
We're done with the red vests on the candidates. Okay, okay, we'll see you about that.
Let that be his thing, yes.
Well, we are down to our last minute and out of time here right now. I want to thank again all of our panelists, Kéren, Charles Dongo, Danny Laub, Mark Rozell, and Bob Holsworth. You've all done an outstanding job of digging deeper into these midterm results. I'd also like to recognize our host, the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, and also want to acknowledge our signature sponsor, Walmart, and the many companies and individuals that have made this evening possible. Thanks to all of you, and have a good night.
Great. And thank you, Julie Carey.
Very welcome. My pleasure.